Okay. Are we on? I guess we'll go ahead and get started. All right. Good to be with you this morning. So I've got some good news and bad news. So the bad news, I'll start with the bad news. The bad news is I might be making some heavy use of some running analogies today, so I apologize. If you don't like that, I apologize up front for that. The good news, though, is this is my last Sunday to teach the quarter, so if you don't like those kind of running analogies, guess what? You're going to get a break from it. You're not going to have to hear those for a while. So it's good and bad. So this morning, I'm going to flip back here. We're going to continue on the Sermon on the Mount, and if you want to go ahead and turn over, I'll have the main scripture on the screen that we're going to look at, but it's in Matthew 7. Specifically, verses 13 and 14 is probably where we're going to spend most of our time. We might go a little bit further in that, just depending upon how time plays out here this morning. But the name of the lesson this morning is The Way of Life. So a wise man once made this statement. Yes, there are two paths you can go by, but in the long run, there's still time to change the road you're on. That wise man is Robert Plant. Okay, I don't know if anybody knows who Robert Plant is in this age group. I'm not sure. I know Julie does. Yep. All right. Robert Plant, lead singer for the rock band Led Zeppelin. 1971, they released their fourth album, which had the song Stairway to Heaven, which is what that lyric, the quote that we just had about two paths that you can go down. And if rock's not your thing, that's fine. I can do more than just running and rock and roll. So let's do some literature. Famous American poet Robert Frost, probably one of the most, I think, probably beloved poems, maybe in American literature, at least in the recent past. The Road Not Taken. So I'll read just the very first part here. Two roads diverged in a yellow wood, and sorry I could not travel both. And be one traveler long I stood, and I looked down one as far as I could to where it bent in the undergrowth. Then took the other just as fair, and having perhaps the better claim, because it was grassy and wanted wear. And the poem continues on. And what's kind of interesting to me about this is probably one of the most misinterpreted poems. I know I probably have misinterpreted what the meaning was. A lot of people actually think that the name of the poem is The Road Less Traveled. And a lot of times this has been interpreted, myself included, to think that the person in the poem that Robert Frost is writing about is somebody that's kind of looking down these two paths and decides, I'm going to go down the one that's less traveled. I'm going to be a little bit of a maverick, all right? I'm going to go kind of against the crowd and kind of do my own thing and make my own path. But most critics, if you actually read, and even what Robert Frost kind of alludes to, the poem's not really about that. And maybe if it was, it'd actually be better suited for today's lesson. But actually, most would read it and say that, well, what he's actually referring to is, a lot of times in our lives, we're faced with these two choices, and we have a habit at times of really maybe stressing about, did we make the wrong decision? Did we make the right decision? Well, what if I would have made that decision? How would have my life have been different? And we kind of get ourselves kind of into this situation of we're kind of always second guessing ourselves. And at the very end of the poem, and you can read this later if you want to on your own, there's a part where the person sighs as they kind of look back, figuratively probably looking back at their life, and kind of makes this sigh. And there's some ambiguity about that sigh. Is that a sigh of satisfaction that, yeah, I did the right thing, I made the right choices, or more of a sigh of, boy, I wish I would have done things different. We don't know. And that's kind of sometimes the beauty, I think, of literature, is it can be very open to interpretation at times. So, what does this have to do with the Sermon on the Mount? Well, let's go ahead and jump into Matthew 7, 13, and 23. And like I said, we're probably going to spend our time really probably around verses 13 and 14. But if we can, we'll go ahead and try to tackle all the way through 23. So let's go ahead and read this together. Enter by the narrow gate, for the gate is wide and the way is easy that leads to destruction, and those who enter it are many. For the gate is narrow and the way is hard that leads to life, and those who find it are few. Now, I believe that in the time of the first century, in the audience that Jesus had when he was going through the Sermon on the Mount, I don't think that this idea of two paths would have been something very unique to them. I think they would have been somewhat familiar with that idea. Okay? And why do I say that? Well, let's just kind of take a few examples. I will not have these scriptures on the screen, but I'm going to read some of these. So, really, if you look at many times throughout Jewish history, especially when there was a transition from one leader to the next, you have this idea of these two paths. So, when Samuel offers his farewell address, he makes a statement in 1 Samuel 12, 23 and 25, "Moreover, as for me, far be it from me that I should sin against the Lord by ceasing to pray for you, for I will instruct you in the good and the right way. Only fear the Lord and serve him faithfully with all of your heart, for consider what great things he has done for you. But if you do wickedly, you shall be swept away, both you and your king." Or when Moses offers his farewell address to Israel in Deuteronomy 30, "See, I've set before you today life and good, or death and evil. If you obey the commandments of the Lord your God, then I command you, as I command you today, by loving the Lord your God, by walking in his ways, and by keeping his commandments and his statutes and his rules, then you shall live and multiply. And the Lord your God will bless you in the land that you are entering to take possession of it. But if your heart turns away and you will not hear, but are drawn away to worship other gods and serve them, I declare to you today that you shall surely perish. You shall not live long in the land that you are going over the Jordan to enter and possess. I call heaven and earth to witness against you today that I have set before you life and death, blessing and curse. Therefore choose life that you and your offspring may live, loving the Lord your God, obeying his voice, holding fast to him. For he is your life and the length of your days, that you may dwell in the land that the Lord has sworn to your fathers." And later on, another transition, when Joshua was transitioning to another, as he retires, he makes a statement in Joshua 24:15, "And if it is evil in your eyes to serve the Lord, choose the day who you will serve, whether the gods your fathers served in the region beyond the river, or the gods of the Amorites in whose land you dwell. But as for me and my house, we will serve the Lord." And really, if you look at really the entire book of Proverbs, I mean, what does it set out to do? I mean, it really kind of sets out that idea of there's a path of wisdom and there's a path of folly. So this idea of having two paths would have been, I think, very well understood by the Jews of the day, the Jesus' audience. And that really probably should be no surprise. I mean, I think this is a metaphor that most of human history probably can relate to. But certainly those in Jesus' audience here on the Sermon on the Mount, I think would have been very familiar with this. But if we kind of go back and read that again, and I've highlighted it in yellow. So he lays out that there's two paths, right? Again, that would have been very familiar, I think, to his audience. But there's a gate that's wide and the way is easy that leads to destruction. And there's a gate that is narrow and the way is hard and leads to life. So, I think, just like really everything else in the Sermon on the Mount, and we've talked about this over the quarter, right? Jesus is kind of taking things and kind of turning it upside down and really challenging the thoughts of certainly the religious rulers at the time, but even just the general population as well, and really taking what they had known or thought and turning it on its head. And I think in this case, it's the same thing, right? He's cranking up the amp to 11. And if you don't get that reference, that's okay. It's from an old movie, Spinal Tap, which is a parody of a rock band. You know, an amp on a guitar amp typically only goes up to 10. There's this scene in the movie, though, where the guitarist, who I don't think he's the brightest guy in the world, you know, he has his amp with dials that go all the way up to 11, even though technically it doesn't increase the volume up any further, but to him, it goes up to 11. And you can't understand when Rob Reiner, who's the mock interviewer, is interviewing him, he can't understand why he said, well, why doesn't it just go to 10? Well, I mean, why do you have it go up to 11? But I think Jesus, again, the point he's making here is that he's taking what maybe they had known or heard and saying, okay, all right, I got it. Guess what? If you want to really be holy, if you want to really be what you need to be, it's going to have to go up a notch. You're going to have to go up. You have to crank that amp up to 11, right? And I find this a bit challenging. Why would the way to life, why would that be difficult, right? And I think to Jesus' audience of the day, you know, I'm kind of wondering what their reaction would have been at first. You know, were they first, you know, kind of listening to this and you know, when he gets to this point on the Sermon on the Mount, and just think about everything he said before this and how challenging it's been. And, you know, at this point, you know, when they first hear this, are they kind of going, oh, okay, teacher, we can understand this. Yeah, Moses talked about those paths. Samuel talked about those paths. Joshua, you know, our teaching, we can understand that. But, you know, did they have, you know, was their reaction at first to kind of just listen to that and kind of go, yeah, we've heard that before? Or did they really listen to what he was saying and kind of go, hey, wait a minute, what's he saying? Why is this difficult? Because I think it's, as a general statement, right, I think we can look at what is said in the Old Testament about this idea, and it's easy maybe to understand why people could draw the conclusion that, oh, if I do what's right, I'm going to have prosperity, and if I do what's wrong, I'm going to get punished in this life, right? And I think, you know, I can understand why they would think that. I mean, subconsciously, I can speak for myself. I mean, that's the only person I should speak for. I mean, it's easy for me to get caught up sometimes in that. If you do the right thing, things are going to go well for you in this life. If you do the wrong thing, guess what? You're going to get punished, and you're getting what you deserve. Now, with that said, you know, I do think the book of Ecclesiastes maybe takes a little bit more of a approach that I would say is a little bit more accurate at times. on how to view, that God blesses both the just and the unjust. I can just imagine the writer of Ecclesiastes just kind of wanting to throw his hands up in the air going, why is this? Because I feel the same thing. But I think it's easy to understand maybe why they would have felt like, at first, maybe they would have thought that, I've heard this. What's so new about this teaching? Maybe some of the ones that were more perceptive immediately caught on, like, oh, wait a minute. Why is this? Why? What are you talking about? It's got to be difficult to do the right thing. The path to life is going to be difficult. And maybe some of those that were a little bit maybe not quite as perceptive, maybe, I don't know, maybe it hit them later. Maybe they kind of reflected back on it and thought, hey, wait a minute. Yeah, there's two paths. I've heard that before, but now this guy's teaching that it's a difficult path. And why is that? I don't know that I have an answer. At least for myself, that's very satisfying. Because, let's read I'm going to read this for you. In 1 Timothy, chapter 2, verses 3 through 4, what does it say? This is good and it is pleasing in the sight of God our Savior, who desires all people to be saved and to come to the knowledge of truth. Okay, so God wants all to be saved, and yet we're talking about this path is going to be difficult. Well, and the other thing we've got here is we've got this idea of two gates, which I tried to represent on this slide. I don't know how well I did that. I guess the narrow gate would be there on the left-hand side. Yeah, make sure I'm pointing the right way. And the broad gate on the right. And, when I started thinking about the gate, I thought, have I kind of viewed that a little bit maybe as a gate, especially with the narrow gate, that this is something that God's put in place to keep people out? Because for me, that's typically what a gate's for. Now, yeah, we can say that a gate could potentially be used to keep things in, whether it's livestock and things like that. But typically with a gate, I think it's in some ways to keep people out. So is Jesus teaching here when he's talking about these gates? Is he talking about, God's kind of erecting these barriers. He's going to make it difficult. He's intentionally making it difficult for you to be able to come in this door or this gate. I don't think that's quite it. Because again, going back to what was just written by Paul in 1 Timothy, he talks about God is desiring all to be saved. I think probably the gate is probably viewed maybe best as a metaphor for a narrowing passage, so to speak, that you have to go through. So maybe think of something like, if you've ever been down to Rock City or some place like that, where you have something that's labeled the Fat Man Squeeze, right? Which is this narrow path that you have to go through, and maybe you have to edge through it sideways to get through it. It's a difficult thing to get through. And I think the idea of a gate is probably more about that. It's more of, not that there's a barrier that's been erected to try to keep anything in or out, as much as it's a way to kind of view that there is a narrowing where it's a little bit more of a challenge to get through. It doesn't mean you can't get through it, but it just means it's more difficult. And I guess along with that, if the metaphor that Jesus was using here, if he was talking about a gate to keep people out of heaven or the right path, well, what would we say about why would there be a gate towards destruction? Yeah, it's a broad gate, but why would there be a gate? So I think that the idea of a gate here that Jesus is using is probably more around, again, that idea that it's a way to express that idea of it's a narrowing to this path, and it's a narrow path. So just reinforcing that idea of a narrow path. All right. Now the running analogies start. So I took this photo this week. Don't know how well you guys can see that. I took this photo this week. I was out at Edwin Warner Park. I spent a lot of time out there running, whether it's the road or trails. And I knew this location, so I had my camera with me when I was running. And I thought, this would be a good way maybe to represent some of the ideas here that I'm going to talk about. So at this particular spot out at Edwin Warner, how well you can see this, you're not right, but you've got the road that's on that right side. And then you've got going to the left, and there's actually a little sign there, hopefully you can see that, but it actually points going up that hill. You've got the blue blaze on the tree. Hopefully that kind of helps you see where the trail is going. But hopefully you can kind of see the little juxtaposition here, the idea of this flat, level road versus this path that's going off to the left in this picture, that immediately to get onto that trail, because I've done this many times, you got to hop over those rocks, you got to start going up that hill, and it goes up for a little ways there, and there's all kinds of rocks, roots, all kinds of obstacles. And I think human nature is to look at that and go, well, why would I want to go over there to the left, up that, going uphill, up those rocks, and I can just stay on this nice paved path and just kind of take a leisurely stroll through, the beautiful nature that's out there at the park. And I get it, right? And certainly in our lives, I think that's very tempting. It doesn't have to just be with, going out to a park. If you look at our lives, a lot of times, don't we want to take the easy path? The path of least resistance? I mean, I know I do. Do I intentionally do things to make things more difficult for myself? Well, maybe. Maybe sometimes I do when it comes to running, but in general in life, no, right? I want to try to do what's easy. I don't want to have to deal with difficulties. The other thing that I think that might be illustrative about this is that when I go out there and run, I run both the roads and the trails that are out there. And there is a definite distinction, right? If I'm out there running on the roads, now it's somewhat hilly, right? So this is, I don't want to say that paved path that you see there. Now, in this particular picture, it's a nice, smooth, level path. But that's not indicative of the entire road there, although it's fairly, it's fairly nice. But one thing I've learned when I run trails is that it takes a different mindset. So, as a runner, if you're used to running on roads, you can pretty much get going, and I'm not going to say it's easy, right? I don't think running's easy. But you can pretty much get going, and there are times, if it's a flat road, I can get my pace going, and it's almost just like a metronome. Boom, boom, boom. I'm just clicking off the miles. Bam, bam, bam. All right, now it's not quite that easy, but hopefully you get the point. I can't do that on a trail, right? And there's a number of reasons why. First off, what you can see here is, right, it's going uphill. So when I run out the trails out there and at Percy Warner, there's a lot of up and down. My pace is going to change. There are times when I'm going to have to slow down. Matter of fact, there's times when I'm going to have to basically hike up those hills. It's just, to run them, you got to save your energy, right? So if you're coming from running on roads, that's going to be very frustrating. You're going to be like, I don't like this. Why am I'm used to my pace. I'm just able to I'm going to go run, 5 miles at, 8-minute mile pace or whatever it is, whatever you want to do. And on a road, you can do that. You get on a trail and guess what? It's not that easy. You're going to have to adjust. You're going to have to learn that there's going to be ups and downs. And oh, by the way, I've got to watch my step. So when I'm running a trail, I am constantly having to scan in front of me and look for what's ahead of me, right? I can't just let my feet go and just kind of let my brain completely disengage and just, when I'm running on the road, I don't have to think about it. I don't have to think about my step. Out on a trail, I got to watch for roots, rocks. I've only fallen once running roads, and that was over, the sidewalk up above Publix out on Old Harding. There was an uneven section of sidewalk, and I tripped on that a number of years ago and fell flat on my face, and had a car was like kind of at the same time was kind of passing me and saw the whole thing, and I was fairly embarrassed by that. But I've fallen a number of times running on trails. Fortunately, I haven't really injured myself too bad, other than just some minor scrapes and bruises. But what's the point? Okay? Or how am I gonna take this and apply this to what Jesus is saying? And this is to me what it's about. When Jesus talks about a wide path that's easy to go down and a narrow path that's difficult, what I think of is kind of what I was just saying, is that, when I'm running a road, I can pretty much almost mindlessly just go. I don't have to give this any thought. I just go. But when I'm running that trail, I got to deal with a lot more coming at me. I got to deal with hills. I got to deal with roots. Whatever it is, I have to constantly be thinking and being prepared about what's coming next and where I'm putting my foot. And I think that's kind of the point here with what Jesus is talking about with this idea of a narrow versus a wide path, is that the narrow path that we're called to is not one that we can just blindly get moving and going down and just living our life and not giving any thought to where our next step is or anything else. It's just, man, set that cruise control and just go. That's not the life we're called to. The life we're called to is more like running this trail, this narrow path, where we have to sit there and focus on every step that we're taking. And oh, by the way, we're going to fall. We're going to mess it up, we're going to fall, and we're going to have to dust ourselves off and pick ourselves back up. We're going to have trials, right? We're going to have ups and downs. There's going to be moments where I'm going up a hill and I'm just dying, my heart's pounding, I'm like, why am I doing this? And then you hit that downhill and boom, you can just cruise for a while. That's a little bit of an exaggeration. But hopefully you get the point. Okay, so what am I saying? Am I saying that life is all about suffering, or that that's what Jesus is teaching, that this narrow path that we're taking, that it's just a slog, that I'm just going to have to suffer through this, and just like when I'm running those trails, I'm just going to be drenched in sweat and the heat, and that's all life's about? Is that it? I mean, it's just Jesus has called us to a life of suffering? Well, let's back up a second there. In Matthew 11, verse 30, it says, "My yoke is easy and my burden is light." Okay, so Jesus says, my yoke is easy and my burden is light. All right, how does that square up with this idea of a narrow path that's difficult? Well, Jesus also teaches in Matthew 18, "If anyone would come after me, let him deny himself and take up the cross and follow me, for whoever would save his life will lose it, and whoever loses his life for my sake will find it." All right? Or, we've been talking about Sermon on the Mount all quarter. Hopefully by now, if you didn't already know, hopefully you'll know that, what Jesus is calling us to in the Sermon on the Mount is difficult. It's not easy. It is turning the world and the way the world views things completely upside down. And oh, by the way, when Jesus says, "My yoke is easy and my burden is light," have you ever thought about when it says, "My yoke is easy"? I think it doesn't seem much easy about a yoke to me. I don't know much about farming. But having to have a yoke, as an oxen would have around their neck, I don't know that I necessarily now view that passage as just saying that, things are going to be nice and easy when you follow Jesus. I don't think that's really what he's teaching. So I think it's true that we're going to suffer in this life. I think that's obvious. Jesus talks about that. And we'll probably see a few more examples of this later. So, back to running. I know you can't see that, and that's okay. That's not the point. You have to read that. That's a 24-week training plan that I'm currently about halfway through for a race that I've got in the end of October. And I was talking about this with Kelly, and she just kind of, it didn't really hit me at first. She's like, 24, she's like, that's like half a year. And I'm like, yeah, you're right. I really hadn't thought of it that way. Yeah, it is. But I have a schedule laid out. This is something I found online that I'm following, right? But so I've got, definite, I got to go do these long runs on Saturday, and I did one yesterday in the middle of that thunderstorm. Do I enjoy that? I'm going to be honest. I don't look I don't look forward to many Saturdays anymore, right? Because that's when I do my longest run of the week typically. And yeah, this is out of my own choosing, right? Right? So I kind of want to make that distinction. A lot of the suffering that we go through in life isn't from our own choosing necessarily. This is just an analogy. But I don't look forward a lot of times to waking up on Saturday mornings and going, great, I'm going to go run 24 miles out in this oppressive humidity like we've had like yesterday. Or thunderstorms and watching lightning bolts come out of the sky. So, why do I do it? Well, and really you can say this about, think about almost anything that's difficult in your life. It doesn't have to be running. You don't have to care anything about running. That's fine. But think about anything in your life that's worthwhile. Education. Raising a family. Work. Just the fact of growing older, right? Those are all huge challenges that we are in. And to me, the point is not necessarily that process that I'm having to go through during that training, right? The idea is I have a goal in mind. So I don't necessarily want to deal with this training that I'm going through, but I have a goal in mind that I want to achieve. And Lord willing, come the end of October, I'm hoping I'm going to finish this race. It's by far the longest race I've ever run. So no guarantees I'm going to finish that, but I'm going to try. So I have that goal in mind, right? And I think this is illustrated. The author of the book, one of the books that we've been using this quarter for the material, and I cannot find my quote. All right, here we go. Ed Gallagher's the name of the author. I think this summarizes it better than I could. Our knowledge of the destination affects fundamentally the easiness of the path. All the more so since Jesus walks the path ahead of us. So I'm going to read that one more time. Our knowledge of the destination affects fundamentally the easiness of the path. All the more so since Jesus walks the path ahead of us. And in Romans, I think Paul expresses at least this idea, I think, pretty well in Romans 5. Therefore, since we've been justified by faith, we have peace with God through our Lord Jesus Christ. Through him, we have also obtained access by faith into his grace by which we stand, and we rejoice in the hope of glory of God. Now, not only that, but we rejoice in our sufferings, knowing that suffering produces endurance, endurance produces character, character produces hope, and hope does not put us to shame because God's love has been poured into our hearts through the Holy Spirit who has been given to us. So it's that idea that, as we go through whatever it is that we're going through in this world, and yes, Jesus calls us to walk this narrow path that's difficult, but knowing that we have a reward at the end, and there's a purpose behind what we're going through, helps put context about what we're going through. And, I'm not going to say we can have joy necessarily in suffering. I don't know. But it certainly can make that suffering that we're going through, I think, certainly maybe a little bit more joyful, if that's possible, knowing that there is a point to this that we're going, whatever it is that we're going through. Yeah?
The narrow path requires you to be more intentional.
Yes.
One thing that we have an advantage over one Jesus preaching to, we already know the ending, and we win.
Exactly.
We already won.
Yep. Yeah, and that's a good way of saying it, right? Is it does this life, and I guess that was the point I guess I was trying to make, how well I made it out, was that, yes, this is a path that we're called to that requires intention. We have to be intentional. We can't just go blindly run headlong, full speed down this smooth path, because guess what? You don't want to get to the end of that path. It's not going where you want it to go, and you're rushing headlong down into it without giving any thought whatsoever. And we do have that ability now in hindsight to be able to look back and go, wow, I see, I can see now that yes, we're called to this path that's narrow, that's difficult, but there's reason for it. Right? And the other thing, I guess, kind of wrap up today, so we are only going to get through verses 13 and 14. The other thing that Jesus brings up is not just that there's these two paths, one that's narrow, and then one that's broad, but also it's the volume on those two paths, right? So here in yellow, those who enter it are many, talking about the broad path for destruction, or few who find the narrow path. So are only a few people going to be saved? Right? So here we have this picture, I guess, of what I think it was an abacus when I got this, but you got all the blue on one and that one lone red on the other side. Are we kind of that lone red on one side, right? That the ones that are saved are going to be few, and then there's going to be many that go to destruction. And Jesus actually answers this. I'm not going to read it because of time, but in Luke 13, 22 and 23, he'd actually, he's asked that question and answers it. However, I would say this. I think it's best maybe to view the few as a relative term. And here's what I mean by that.
Say the few that find it.
Right, only a few can find it. In Revelation 7, verse 9, so this is John talking about the vision that he has. After this I looked, and behold, a great multitude that no one could number from every nation, from all tribes and people and languages, standing before the throne and before the Lamb, clothed in white robes with palm branches in their hands, and crying out with a loud voice, "Salvation belongs to our God who sits on the throne and to the Lamb." So to me, it's a beautiful image that John is writing there. This idea of a great multitude from every, no one could number, from every nation, from tribes and people and languages standing before the throne. Now, I recognize that the book of Revelation is a book of, a lot of symbolic language. However, I don't think that detracts from this point that what John is seeing and writing here is this idea of a great multitude in heaven that's before God and praising the Lamb. So, yes, the path is narrow. It's difficult. Few will find it, although I think there'll be, in the grand scheme of things, it will be a large number if we can take what was said there in the book of Revelation. But I think it just underscores the idea that, human nature is to look for the easy way. To wrap things up here, that would be the point, I think, is that it's easy for us to look for the easy path. That's just, I think, the way humans are. And, God has not put up any gates to the number, to getting to heaven, or limited the number, as some might believe, that only a certain number, literal number of people, 144,000, are going to be saved. The only limiting factor is ourselves, right? God has made salvation available to all. And as again, we talked about what Paul had written in 1 Timothy. He desires all to be saved. as many people as possible can fit through that narrow gate, which might seem contradictory, and get into that path. The problem is us. The problem is we don't want to have to put that kind of effort into it as humans, not necessarily talking about the audience here this morning, but as humans, as society in general, we don't want to have to kind of put that kind of effort into it. And that's where things really get tripped up, right? And I think that's what Jesus is talking about when he's talking about this metaphor of the gate and this narrow path. The gate's there. God's going to welcome everybody that comes down that gate and that path. The problem is we as humans are going to limit ourselves because we don't want to have to deal with difficult things in life, right? Okay. All right, so that's it for me. I've enjoyed being here this quarter, and we are dismissed.